Alright, so this knife thoughts video is going to be on how to drop the kick on a traditional or slip joint knife, and unfortunately my audio didn't work well, so I am having to do this as a voiceover. Alright, so as you can see, the tip does sit a little bit high on this. For some people this might not be a proud tip, but for me it does sit a little bit higher than I'd like, so I'm going to use this as an example to show you how to drop the kick or file the kick, however you want to say it, on a traditional slip joint knife. Now, first off, I do want to say that I recommend, before trying this yourself, reaching out to the manufacturer. In particular, I know GEC will drop kicks generally, so it's always worth reaching out to the manufacturer before you try to do it yourself. So what is dropping the kick on a knife? Well, I'm going to use this Great Eastern Cutlery number 47 to show you. So what you're going to do is you're going to actually file this kick area, which is a part of the tang, and it does look a little different on the keychain knife. But you file that tang area, and the goal of it is to make the tip sit deeper in the blade well. And what this kick does is it's what stops the blade from moving further down into the blade well when you close the knife. So it actually hits the back spring and holds the knife in place there. So there's kind of two issues that you have to be aware of when you are filing a kick or dropping the kick. And that's that if you file that kick enough, the blade might be able to close down into that blade well so much that it creates blade wrap. And blade wrap is when the edge of the knife hits the back spring and causes some kind of deformation, usually just a roll in the edge, but it can be, chips and things like that also. So the second thing that you have to be aware of is that when you drop the kick, because it starts to change the relative position of the backspring to the pivot, because the kick allows the backspring to move up closer to the pivot, it can make the backspring end up sitting lower in the handle and actually make it so that it sits below the liners. So that's another thing you have to be aware of. Just make sure when you're dropping a kick that you are aware that those two things can come from it if you go too fast, if you take too much off of the kick, and you just have to be careful. So as you can see, the kick on these 05 keychain knives is a little different than on the 47, and that's because they're actually the secondary blades from the number 38 English Whittler. So the kick is a lot closer to the liners and harder to get at. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move the blade between full open and half stop so that it's easier to access that kick, and I'll just hold it there with my finger so I'm able to file at it. So you can use several different things to do this. Generally, people recommend just a normal file, but you can also use a sharpening stone like this, particularly if it has a diamond side like this Wesson pocket sharpening stone. You can also, though, because it's a little big for something like this and for a lot of knives, use a kind of a nail file. This is just a dollar store one. It's a little smaller, a little bit more slender, so you can get in there a little easier. And the edges aren't super rough, but they're not super, not rough either. So generally, I prefer on something especially small like this to use a Victorinox Classic. And the reason for that is because it has this nail file, and this one has been used a lot, so it's not as rough anymore, but they are pretty good files, and then they have these flat edges on the sides and then the flats there that make it so you don't have to worry as much about marring up the edges of the knife, so either hitting the edge and or hitting the liners on the knife. So when you're filing here, you aren't as likely, because of those flats, to hit and kind of scratch up the rest of the knife. So we'll get right to it here, and what you want to do is just nice and light, go back and forth, trying to keep it even with the tang. And you'll notice here that I'm using my thumb to kind of hold it there. And then you can go ahead and see that it is not marring up the liners, and you want to check to see if it took that tip down where you wanted it to go every now and then, pretty frequently, so that you're not dropping the kick too much. And you also want to check to make sure you're not starting to get any blade wrap. But it didn't really go down as much as I wanted. There is no blade wrap though, so that's a good thing. So we'll kind of start and go a little further. So just going a little bit more here, trying to make sure to keep the file from hitting the liners with your thumb, and trying to keep it even with the tang. Just going nice and light and taking a little bit more off. Again, checking to see if there is any blade wrap here, checking to see how deep the tip sits, and it's definitely getting there, but I think I'd like it to sit a little lower. It doesn't have any blade wrap yet, so we can keep going. And just a little bit more of the same thing here. So here I accidentally push the blade to half stop, and that's because I'm having to hold it partway between full open and half stop. But because of those flat edges on the file on the Victorinox Classic, it didn't do any damage to the blade or the liners. So I can go back to it without worrying about it too much. Now you don't have to worry about that happening on a more normal knife or a knife with a more normal tang, because you can have it at full open and not have to put that pressure on the back of the blade to keep it open to the right amount. So that's not something you really have to worry about normally when dropping a kick, but thankfully it didn't do any damage here. And since we're almost there, just a little bit more, just giving it a couple more passes to try to get it just where I want it so that the tip sits well within the frame, but it still doesn't have blade wrap. So again, going nice and easy, not gouging it, not putting too much pressure, just going back and forth to keep it smooth. And I think that that is going to do it. So go ahead and close it here. Make sure it doesn't have blade wrap. Now, one thing is that it did drop that spring a little bit, so it does sit just ever so slightly low, but not too much there. And it did bring the tip well within the frame so that I'm happy with where it sits. So you can see you don't have to go super hard, you don't have to do a lot, but you do want to do it nice and gradually so that you don't get that blade wrap. So it looks like there is no blade wrap and the tip sits pretty well within the frame. So I am happy with this and can move on to the next step. Now, one last thing that I often do here is I check for burrs on either side of the kick, because sometimes when you are filing the kick down there, you can create little burrs, and you don't want those to be catching on the liners and making the opening and closing rough. So you can just ever so lightly make sure that it's really light, file the sides of the kick there so that it gets those burrs off. And again, you really want to make sure you go light on this, because if you go too heavy and it creates kind of deep gouges in the sides of the tang, that can actually also make the opening less smooth, opening and closing less smooth. So you just want to do it enough that it gets the burrs off, but no more. So again, sorry that I had to do a voiceover for this. The audio just wasn't matching up, but this is how I drop a kick, and in particular on a smaller knife with the Victorinox Classic. I hope it's been helpful for you. If it has, make sure you give the video the thumbs up. You can also subscribe to my channel and click the bell so you know when I post new videos. And make sure you check out my social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook at Knife Thoughts, and my website knifethoughts.com, where I post articles on knives and knife related topics like this. And as always, last but not least, don't forget to go out and do good.